Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Monday night edition of The People Show on intellectualradio.com, iHeartRadio, Instagram, Facebook, and on YouTube. I am Mark Wallace, your host and facilitator for this week's edition of The People Show. We're going to be talking about very important um, issues. We're going to be talking about the Democratic Party. I'm a registered Democrat, you're a registered Democrat, but we have to transform the Democratic Party. We're also going to be talking with Ed Yohnka, who is the Director of Communications and Public Policy at the ACLU. We're going to be talking about the Trump deportation and ICE and what we can do to make sure that our constitutional protections and Americans' constitutional protections are in place and not being validated, or I should say, being protected. And we're also going to talk to Ed about what is happening here locally with the Cook County State's Attorney that is empowering police, starting in a pilot program in two predominantly African American communities over at the 7th District and the 5th District. The 7th District is in Englewood, and the 5th District largely is Roseland. And we're going to be talking about the unilateral decision that she made to empower police to charge people with low-level gun felony charges without any type of administrative review. We don't know of a legal basis for which we have to fight back, but we can fight back and push back from the voters' perspective. And this is where you and I have got to get off the couch. We've got to connect ourselves together. We have to unify. We have to build a basis, and we have to build a base in order for us to push back and transform the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is the problem. Not certain Democrats, but the Democratic Party is our problem. Why we are losing election, why we are losing, Democrats are losing the trust of Democratic voters because they don't believe them, they don't trust in them, and they don't believe that they are identifying with what is important to we, the people. But in order for that to change, we, the people, must engage. We, the people, must organize ourselves in order for us to transform this. And I am calling on the African American community in Chicago and in Cook County, where we have more than 1.5 million registered Black voters in Chicago and Cook County, that we have the power to pull in at least 25% of the registered Black voters in Chicago and build a base, a Black independent voting bloc, so that we can infiltrate the Democratic establishment, because the Democratic Party does not respect, obviously, or the Democratic Party is out of touch and are not willing to listen to its constituents. And far too long, the Democratic Party has decided who candidates will be that you and I vote for. But that should come from the people. It should come from we, the people, who, one, select the candidates and elect the representative that we want to represent us, that we send to these public office, local, state, and federal, that we give them the mandate of the agenda, of the issues that must be addressed for our communities. We have to redress these concerns, and we can't sit on the sideline. It's not a spectator sport to do it. It is not where you sit on the sideline and we dictate to someone else what and how that happens. You and I have to engage this system. That is the only way that it is going to change. It is not going to change by complaining to each other, and we're not willing to get into the game. The only way that it is going to change is that you and I have to get into the game to address and redress the complaints that we have, and we have to do it together. I'm going to be talking about Democrats. We can talk about what Republicans are doing, but we have to talk about what we want as Democrats, and we have to remind them of what we expect from them now, which is why it is important for us to put ourselves in the position that we can select and elect. We have to be the selector of the candidates, and we have to be the electors of the representatives. That is what is called power. That's what power is. Power is when we have put ourselves in the position to use the power that we have available to us, that when we select and when we elect, that person, those persons that we send to office, go to those offices understanding that they got there by we the people, and which means that they have to be held to account and they have to respond to we the people. And if they do not respond to we the people, they will be replaced. The other side of that is when we demonstrate that we have the institutional organized base that we can select and elect, it will send a message to the rest of the fabric of the Democratic establishment. Now, either the Democratic establishment is going to have to get in tune with its base so that they talk to we the people and respond to we the people. And if they can't respond to we the people who actually pays their salaries and pays for their livelihood, then that means we the people have to fire them and hire somebody else who is going to produce. That is how this works. It is very simple. It is very clear. It will not work when we are operating in silos. We continue to be fractionized. We continue to operate under individualism, which are both toxic cancer to our progress, and it only benefits the establishment. When they see that we're operating like this, my fingers represents the people. But when we are operating like this together, that means that we are going in the same direction and that we are calling on our representatives. Now, don't get bogged down in the weeds of the purity test, meaning that we start dissecting things that we don't agree on. There is no group, no family that is going to agree on every single solitary thing, but it doesn't mean that the family is going to break up. So let's not get caught up with all of that and bylaws and this or that or the other. Let's make the commitment first. Wherever you live in Chicago, in Cook County, as a registered Black voter or as a Black citizen that will become a voter sometime, let us organize ourselves together, not to be anti anybody else, but to be pro the diaspora of our communities. and to send a message that we are no longer operating in the status quo that we have operated for the past 30, 40, 50, 60 years. That we are now taking charge. So I put the number in the screen. Text 855-909-1385 so that you can get into the text alert. And then you could join us for the meetings as we are organizing. We are organizing, and then when we have a strong enough base, we can put whatever kind of structure that we need to put in place. But the first thing that we have to do is we have to organize a massive base of us. There are critical elections that are going to be taking place in 2026. And we should be the selectors of the candidates, because I'm not impressed with any of the candidates. I'm not impressed with Juliana Stratton. I'm not impressed with Robin Kelly. I'm not impressed with Christian up north, whatever his name is. Not that I don't like these people, but those people were not selected by us. Robin Kelly was not selected by us. This is not a personal attack. This is about putting ourselves in the position so that the people in public office know that we are no longer accepting what they have been doling out, which is not much of anything, not much of any substance. The idea that they could give a preferential few some trinkets and that somehow we are supposed to be excited about that. No, we have to see measurable progress and a structure and plan and of investments from education to economics in our communities across the diaspora. And that comes from the tax dollars that we pay highly into, that they are reinvested in our communities, in our schools, in our infrastructure, to bring industries in our communities where big industry can operate in our communities and hire from our communities. Labor was 70% of all Black employment in Chicago in 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Ronald Reagan came in and gutted that. We can put people in place that can go out and cultivate those types of relationships to bring industry to our communities, to strengthen the job workforce in our communities, bring the tax revenues in our communities, where we could have a much more agrarian society, where we have people that we don't have the kinds of unemployment that we currently have. The kind of unemployment that we currently have, that it persists in our communities. What does that mean? That simply means this. We have young African American men between the ages of 18 and 25 that are out of work and or out of school at the rate of 47%. And that is because there has been no plan put in place to cultivate relationships, to bring industry into our communities that people from our communities can take advantage of, the job base, and those communities can take advantage of the workforce, right? So it becomes a partnership. Remember, U.S. Steel hired thousands of people from the south side of Chicago, and I would presume some of the west side of Chicago and some of the southern suburbs. But there was a workforce there. And that workforce that workforce was able to sustain and support a very strong African American business district on the south side of Chicago. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later on in the program. We're going to also talk about property taxes. We're going to talk about the difference between the assessor's office, and we're going to be talking about the difference between the Board of Review. And you may be surprised at who is really responsible for causing your real estate taxes to increase. That we're going to be talking about a little bit later on in the program. As I told you, we're going to be talking with my guest, Edwin Yohnka, who is the Director of Communications and Public Policy for the ACLU. And he is my guest, and he's joining us now. I want to welcome him to the program. Ed, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm well, Mark. How about you today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
All right, listen, well, we had a conversation, you and I talked about some things, and we're going to talk about this. I want to talk about what's going on with the Trump administration and with ICE and the deportations and what the ACLU is doing to fight back against this and to making sure that constitutional protections are guarded. And then we also want to talk about some things that are happening here locally. But let's start with what's happening with the deportations and ICE. What many of us see happening, many of us see this as being a very inhumane practice that we see unfolding. And of course, the Supreme Court has further supported the administration in carrying out these inhumane activities by limiting the powers of federal judges in terms of stopping the administration nationally from enforcing public policy or policies that are antithetical to what we believe to be American. So how is the ACLU working in that area?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways to think about what we're doing. The first is at the national level. We have engaged in a number of different legal challenges to the Trump deportation and detention policy that they've put forward over the last 6 months. So, for example, we are at the center of the litigation challenging the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, which is being used. This is a 19th century law that's being used, was used to deport hundreds of people, essentially to a gulag in El Salvador, simply on the assertion that those people were part of a gang, in this case, Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang, and simply on the basis of someone's tattoos or some unverified source, they were sent to that facility. So that's one thing that we're doing. The second thing is that we've been challenging a number of the specific policies that the administration has put in place. In Southern California, we were part of the effort that challenged the targeting Home Depot parking lots where day laborers work, or garden centers, or sites where there were lots of landscapers or things of that nature. And some, we're also challenging in Florida the use of traffic stops to essentially stop anyone who looks to be Latino and then ask them to prove their citizenship. So across the country and nationally, we're engaged in assuring that, we're at least putting up the constitutional fight to these policies as they're being implemented, which trample, as you say, due process and all sorts of constitutional rights. At the local level, where we're really focused is on assuring that the provisions of the Trust Act, the protections that have been put in place in Illinois, to assure that state and local law enforcement do not engage in assistance in terms of executing federal civil immigration enforcement, to make sure that that's respected across the state. We filed we filed an amicus brief in the case where the Trump administration has sued the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois, and Cook County. We've been, engaged in that litigation. We've also been monitoring what's been happening across the state to assure we don't have a rogue sheriff or a rogue police chief in some community that decides they're going to, because of their own political views, violate Illinois law and participate in federal civil immigration enforcement. So, those are really at the core of what we've been doing in the courts and, in terms of advancing Illinois protections. But I think the other thing that we've tried to do repeatedly is just lift up the stories of people who have been swept up in these raids, who are not the worst of the worst. They're not the killers and the murderers and the rapists that we were promised were going to be part of this. They're simply people who own businesses, who are working every day in our communities. Some of them own homes. Some of them, our kids go to school with their kids. These are folks who are really like many of us. And so, we've really been engaged in trying to lift those stories up and call out the tactics of ICE. I can't, every time I talk about this, I can't believe I'm saying this, but literally today in Chicago, there are heavily armed, masked men marauding about town, unidentified in unmarked vehicles, and just kidnapping people off of our streets. This is dangerous, and someone is going to get hurt or killed before this is over because they see something like that and try to interdict. And so one of the things we've been trying to do repeatedly is just call attention to this, try to bring others to call attention to it, along with our partners in the immigration space, certainly folks like the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, and the organized communities against deportation, to try to just make people aware of what it is that's happening. And I think, as we've seen, in recent days, there have been, 3 or 4 different public opinion polls that have been released that indicate that, for most people, this is not the immigration policy that they thought they were supporting, even those who voted for Donald Trump. And one of the realities is that we all need to push back against this.
Well, speaking of you think somebody was going to get killed, we do remember that the undocumented migrant in California, Jamie Garcia, who fell to and was, terribly injured, fell 30 feet and eventually succumbed to those injuries and died.
Right.
Now, one of the things that is concerning to me is who are these people that are considered to be ICE? Who are they? Are they employed by the federal government? Is this some private security? How do we know that these people are, legitimate law enforcement?
Mark, it's interesting. The question you ask is one that I get asked almost everywhere I go. Are these really ICE? In many communities, there are reports or rumors or speculation about whether or not these folks are, Proud Boys who just are pretending to be ICE and engaging in this behavior. What we believe and what we know as of now is that the folks who are engaged in this behavior and the people that we're seeing on our streets who are masked are either ICE agents or other federal agents, either from Customs and Border Patrol, from the FBI, from ATF, and from the Department of Homeland Security, security forces who have been detailed to work with ICE on these detention raids. And so we know that there are concerns, but we don't have any reports of, people who are actually not ICE agents engaging in this enforcement. But I want to add just two other data points. Number one of the things we are seeing across the country in several places are reports of masked people who come into a restaurant or other thing pretending to be ICE agents and then are just executing a robbery. This idea or this kind of example of the agents behaving in that way is creating, some opportunity for people who want to use that for nefarious reasons. The other thing that I think is really troubling to think about and important to know is that, in the Reconciliation Act that was signed into law on July 4th, there is more than $150 billion for ICE enforcement and for detention. The ICE enforcement piece of that budget will make ICE, akin to the army of most European countries. And they are going to be recruiting thousands of people to become ICE agents and train those people and put them on our streets. And I think one of the things that is, of concern to us is how do you who is it who joins ICE at this moment? Having seen, as some of the video, having seen the behavior, having heard the words from the president or, Stephen Miller or Tom Homan about the way in which they expect ICE officers to behave, I think there's a concern about if there are people pretending today to be ICE, what does that look like in a year or 18 months when they bring online people that they've recruited in this environment? And so I think that's something to continue to watch.
All right. The ACLU had a recent legal victory to something that was to the akin of a class action decision that was done. I'm not sure, was that in Colorado? I can't remember exactly where it was. Talk to me a little bit about that and how that sets up to hold the administration at bay, or certainly hold them into account for doing these, what many of us refer to as illegal raids.
Yeah. And actually that was, an action that was in Southern California, and the case, I think the one that you're talking about, where the ACLU, along with other partners in Southern California, brought a lawsuit challenging the ICE behavior, which was, targeting places where mainly Latino people worked. Again, the parking lots of Home Depot as day laborers, or in garden centers, in large landscaping areas, in the fields of California, in terms of bringing in crops, are mainly Latino folks. And what they were able to, what the ACLU and others were able to demonstrate is that people were being targeted in that way, not on the basis of their legal status or lawful status in the United States, because there's no way to tell that from the outside, but frankly, were being targeted as the result of their race. And that was a place where the courts were able to say that the administration and ICE had to stop those raids, and had to cease the kind of behavior that it was engaged in, and could only target folks on the basis of some probable cause, of some knowledge that there was a person who was in fact deportable, and they're unlawful and deportable, and could take action against that individual, rather than these kinds of dragnet sweeps that we're seeing in large swaths, and going into communities and just picking up anybody who looked Latino and making them prove their citizenship.
Do we have any way of knowing if any of these people who've been deported or been detained are actually American citizens. I heard Congressman Maxwell Roth of Florida, who went to the Alcatraz
Yeah.
detainment uh,
Yes.
facility and said that there were some people who yelled or screamed out that they were actually American citizens. Do we have any knowledge or any intel whether or not there are actually Americans that have been detained in these raids?
Yeah, we actually know that since the administration came into being in January of 2025, that there have been a number of United States citizens who have been swept up and detained, sometimes for long periods of time before their status has been discovered and they've been released. In fact, in one instance here in Chicago, which we know because of a case that the ACLU has been doing with the National Immigrant Justice Center for the past 7 years, that grew out of some ICE raids during the first Trump administration. What we know is that there was, in fact, an American citizen who was picked up in Chicago in February. He was driven around for hours and interrogated. When they finally figured out they had an American citizen and not someone who was undocumented person, they simply dropped him off in some area far away from his car and far away from his home. So that's something that we actually know because we talked to that person. There's an affidavit in an enforcement action that we're pursuing here in the Northern District of Illinois as the result of that case. And we hear across the country about people who are regularly detained and are picked up and detained, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, only for ICE to discover that they have someone who is a US citizen. When all you think is about, we've all heard the stories about Stephen Miller calling the district directors to Washington, D.C., and screaming at them about how they have to bring up their numbers and how they have to, meet certain quotas. When you are driven by that kind of mania, you're gonna make mistakes. And I think we've seen that happen already. And I think that's something we're just going to see more of as we go forward.
Well, of course, the campaign is to get rid of, and I call it a disguise, but the campaign was to get rid of the people who were the most dangerous, people who were in the country illegal or undocumented. That's who the administration is going after. Do we have a sense of how many of those people were that are actually successfully removed versus the people that they're going raiding farms and other areas, restaurants?
Yeah.
I don't. Do we have any idea of that?
What's interesting is that we're getting most of that information not from the government itself, but from journalists. There was, in fact, a story in this morning Chicago Tribune that did an analysis of people just in the Midwest region and the Chicago area who had been detained and deported in this administration versus the last one. And of course, what they discovered is that while deportations and efforts at deportations and detentions are, vastly expanded in this particular administration compared to the Biden administration, that in fact they're actually by percentage deporting far fewer people with serious criminal charges. The Washington Post has looked at these numbers as well. For example, for the people who are being housed in the so-called alligator Alcatraz, that you may remember when the president visited there a day or so before it was going to open, he declared that this would be for the worst of the worst. The vast majority of people who are being held in that facility were stopped on something like minor traffic offenses. These are not people who have violent records, who, have engaged in the kinds of crime wave that we were promised that was going to be part of this. And I think it's one of the things, Mark, that is really troubling, which is that this whole entire enterprise is predicated on a couple of different things. The first is, if you look at whether it's the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, or you look at, the invocation of the National Guard, or the use of other kinds of militaristic tactics, we were told that our country had been invaded. That simply is not true. It simply is not true. And the second thing we were told is that there was this mass number of people who had come into our country without documentation who were committing violent crime. Again, if you look at the data, that simply isn't happening. That it's just, frankly, there's no other way to say it. It's just a lie. And as a result of that, we're getting, this sort of militaristic um, uh, you know, uh, situation where the administration is ignoring court orders. They're engaged in sort of misleading courts or lying to courts about what they're doing. They're sending people off to these kinds of gulag situations in other countries, and they're engaged in all of these behaviors, and yet there isn't really any there at the end of the day. And I think that's the thing that is, in many ways and in many forms, what is most disconcerting is that we aren't getting the worst of the worst, but we're picking up the grandma from Cicero, or the aunt from Cicero, or the grandma from Missouri, who's been a waitress in a particular restaurant for 30 years. And I think that's why people are starting to, as you see in this, people have really turned in terms of their support or willingness to support this administration's policies, because this is not what they expected. And it's certainly nothing that they ever expected to see on the streets of our cities.
Yeah, I saw a recent poll before we came on tonight that showed that more than 40% of the president's supporters, or certainly 40% of Americans, do not support the way that the president and the administration is handling these deportations. And I think in that, in a real sense, for people who really do not pay attention to the history of what's been happening around immigration. Immigration is something that has been politicized for decades. I consistently say that we can solve the immigration problem in 15 minutes if we had a Congress that was really interested in
Right.
solving this problem that we have. It's not going to be perfect, but certainly can make it better and stop weaponizing the border as though it is some type of cabal there, that, like it's a nuclear weapon or something.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you think about it, we've known for years that because we're living with antiquated immigration rates in terms of the number of people we lawfully allow into the country, that we're not meeting the needs for a growing and a burgeoning economy. That it was that we were always going to have to create more pathways to permanence for more people. I think that what we've seen is especially in the last decade, is that there is just a hardcore part of at least one of our political parties who simply do not want a solution to that, because they fear the change in demographics in our population more than they actually want a controlled immigration system that serves everybody involved, including those people who are coming here, so they can't be, coerced into working for sub minimum wage and other things as the result of their status. And so I think you're right that if we just had people who were actually looking towards a solution rather than being fearful of either the politics and or fearful of some conspiracy theory, that we would actually be moving towards those solutions now.
Yeah, and it seems like we are even further from um, that happening even in our lifetime. I'm not sure if,
Yeah.
in fact, you know, in particular, when you had a bipartisan bill for the first time, probably in decades, since certainly since the late '80s, early '90s, where both sides had come up with at least an approach to trying to deal with the immigration policy. And this administration said, do not support it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when there are people who think that this is the person who is going to improve those conditions when they are actually telling people, okay, you finally come up with something, don't
But
support
don't
it.
do it. Right. Don't do
Don't
it.
do
We
it.
don't want that. And think about, I'll just say, one of the things about one of the only things that I found really comforting about getting old is that you see almost everything, right? And you see the cycles of things. And to think of, as you said, the late 1980s, and think about, Ronald Reagan's farewell speech and talking about the importance of immigration and immigrants to a society. And that is, that kind of language would be verboten now. And on top of that, you have, as you say, people who don't want a solution. They want something that they can fix. And I'll say that I think this, what is concerning to us at the ACLU is that once you go down the road of militarizing, this kind of enforcement, um, it's hard to pull back from that use for other things, right? The president exaggerates by leaps and bounds, violent crime rates in our cities. Do we think that if he were cleared to put military forces in our cities, major cities, in order to enforce his immigration policy, that he wouldn't keep them there for crime control? That he wouldn't keep them there to tamp down First Amendment activity that he doesn't like? I mean, I think that one of the things is that it feels like this is the whole immigration discussion is simply a test to see how much we'll tolerate for a lot of other things that the administration would really like to do.
That's exactly what I believe in, that this administration is pushing the envelope to see just how far. It's like throwing mud against the wall to see what will actually stick. If he's allowed to do this to one group of people, and he has been sanctioned and giving the wherewithal to do this to one group of people, then he can further his authoritarianism goals to do that to people who are actually born and bred here in this country to act out his will. And it is very disconcerting that people do not understand or can see that, because he has weaponized one certain group and demonized a group of people so that the rest of the the country can hate those people, so that he could carry out those egregious acts to see if he can get away with it, and thusly it will then come back that he can exact that on people here in this country who don't, support or agree with whatever it is he wants to do.
And I think to that point, and it was you made reference in your original introduction about, the role that the courts are playing in this. I think what is very troubling, um, for the ACLU and certainly for me individually is, I think a lot about the fact that you know, the the Alien Enemies Act. The Alien Enemies Act, which is a late 19th century, for your followers who don't know this, is a late 19th century law. It is the only remaining act from the Alien and Sedition Act, and it allows the government to remove non-citizens in a time of either a declared war or if the country has been invaded. Neither of those things have happened.
Right.
The president says that we've been invaded by the country of Venezuela because, Trende Aragua is working with the Venezuelan government. His own intelligence sources don't believe that and don't say that. But he asserts it, and yet the courts, in many ways, especially the Supreme Court, treat his assertions as though they are deserving of some sort of equitable treatment, of some sort of, a benefit of the doubt. This is the person who made up a story about what was happening in Springfield, Ohio, and Aurora, Colorado during the campaign. This is the person who said, I've never, my uncle knew the Unabomber, and it turns out the Unabomber wasn't identified until 10 years after his uncle was dead. But this is the guy who everybody says, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. And I think you're right. This is a testing of, if I can do this here in this way, if I can just make up and create a narrative, and the courts will accept it and people will go along with it, and I can, sort of instill and impose my will in these areas now. I can do that with something else later. I can do this, with cities. I can do this with other kinds of domestic enforcement. And I think this is the kind of authoritarian model that worries so many of us.
Well, we can remember in his first term when he went to see Kim Jong-un in North Korea, came back and he wanted a military parade. And then he also came back and he said, look, as president of the United States, I should be able to do whatever it is that I want to do. This is what this individual is interested in. He's interested in being able to amass power and to make decisions at his will, regardless of who it harms, to appease himself. That hurts the entire country, and it will be decades before some of the damage that he is causing that will be able to be reversed. So yeah. I think that people need to really understand this much more comprehensively than them hating on some poor people who is just trying to escape horrific, dire conditions that no human being would want to be in. Do I believe that we need to? Yes, we need to do something. Is this the way to do it? Absolutely not.
No.
And this is not the way that we should humanly be treating other human beings and just devaluing them as though they're not human. And that's what this approach is.
And I think it's really important to remember that if you can begin to do that today to a group of people, you can do it tomorrow to a different group of people. And ultimately, it is, it's all of us who are at risk once we let this start to fall. I think it's just one of those truths about freedom and liberty, that if we don't protect them for everybody, if we don't protect due process, if we give in to those worst angels for some people, ultimately this will be visited upon us.
Absolutely. I hope people certainly understand that. Let me turn to something here locally. We got a few minutes left. We want to turn to locally. The Cook County State's Attorney, Eileen O'Neill Burke, when she was elected, she did two things. And I think she did those two things to send a message. As soon as she got elected, the first thing she did was to dismiss the charges of a police officer who was caught on video, shown on video, by pummeling a young, I think it was an Arab American young man in Oakland.
Yes.
That he was insulted. And as soon as she got into office, she dismissed those charges. The second thing that she did was that she unilaterally decided, along with the support of the superintendent of police that she was going to use as a pilot program to empower police officers to charge these gun felony charges without review. And the pilot program started in the 5th district, and I'm sorry, in the 7th district, which is largely Inglewood, and then the 5th district, which is in Roseland. And I saw the announcement that when it was first made in some little innocuous newspaper early on that nobody really paid attention to until the spring, when some people started to find out that this was going on. We went to a meeting, and one of her policy people came there and said that there were 47 cases that had already been put before the court. 30 of those cases withstood court review, and the other 17 cases obviously did not. So that's like a 65%, success rate. When I was in school, if you scored a 65%, you flunked.
Wasn't anything to boast about.
Right. So, and I have been very concerned about this, very actually offended by that. From what we understand is that police officers have not passed the bar. They have not sworn, they're not licensed attorneys. They're not prosecutors, which prosecutors are empowered with certain skill sets and training to arrest and review evidence to determine whether or not there's a probable cause to charge someone with a felony.
Right.
What's the ACLU's position on this?
We're troubled by this in the same way that you are, on a number of different levels. The first is, and I think it's really important for people to understand this, an arrest is simply something that's done on the basis of the judgment of a single police officer, as you say, who is trained to do their job, but not trained in the law. And allowing officers to make a determination on a gun charge as to whether that is charged as a misdemeanor or a felony is a significant decision that shouldn't be left to a single police officer on the street. Because number one, there is too much of a chance of an error in judgment in terms of making that call. And secondly, it may be that the decision is influenced by a whole range of things that have nothing to do with the legal merits of the case itself. Did the person call the officer a name? Did they speak back to them? Did the officer think they weren't cooperative enough? What was the nature of the interaction? Again, same circumstances, different outcome, depending on, for example, how an officer feels that someone behaved in a particular set of circumstances or other things. So I think that's one element of it. It's just too much authority to give over to police, because having a felony charge is a very serious matter. And so, I think it for all the reasons that you described is really problematic. The second thing that I think is really troubling is if you pull back from that individual officer and pull back and think about the Chicago Police Department globally. This is an agency that has not earned the trust to make those kinds of decisions on the street. This is and I thought it was interesting. I just a little digression here. There was a front page story in one of the papers last week about the, great drop in the number of traffic stops that the Chicago Police Department had conducted, when just a few weeks earlier, they acknowledged to a different outlet they had underreported their stops by more than 200,000. So there wasn't a drop. There was no decrease. And meanwhile, we know that in the past 18 months, the use of force by Chicago police officers, including shootings of civilians, has gone up significantly. So, you take all that together along with the fact that, the department after 6 years has managed to get, you want to talk about your grading when you were in school, try this one on for size. After 6 years under a federally supervised consent, a federal court supervised consent decree, they've managed to achieve 16% of the matters that they were required to do. And most of those are simply checking boxes by writing a policy or doing something. It doesn't mean that it's actually being enforced that way on the streets. So this is not a department which has earned the benefit of the doubt to do that. But the last thing is, and I cannot stress this enough, that even if you decided that you could overlook all of that and give the power to police to do this, you decide that the place where you're going to do it is in just Black and brown communities.
Right.
That those are the places where you really need to do this, where this is the most important thing. And that as long as we're going to test this, let's test this only with people of color. And let's enhance their opportunity to be incarcerated. I mean, it just doesn't, for all of the work that I think we've done over the last decade in this state in a variety of different ways to try to address wrongs in our criminal legal system, that is just really backtracking on all of this in a significant way. And so, for those reasons, we've been opposed to this. We made our position clear to the state's attorney. She seems to be moving forward with this process and this project. And, I think it's a really bad way to start it, her administration.
Yeah, well, and one of the reasons that they put forth in the meeting that this was being done was because she asked the superintendent of police what were the challenges that they were having. And supposedly the response was that, our officers spend too much time having to write reports and that are off the street. And, that sounds like a personnel problem or that they don't.
I think it's also a training problem.
Yes.
Right? Because they don't teach them how to efficiently do those things.
Absolutely. But we certainly should not compromise a person's constitutional protections because you have a personnel problem or you have a training problem, as you
right.
suggest.
Right.
So, my question is there is it the governing body of the state or that empowers a prosecutor with the power to charge a person, and that the prosecutor has the power to enlist a police officer to give them that power?
Essentially, that's right. The power to charge is in the hands of the prosecutor or the state's attorney. The state's attorney can delegate, to assistant state's attorneys or decide, whose authority they're going to accept or whose decision they're going to accept in filing those charges, and that could certainly include the recommendation from police. I think that one of the things, in that telling of this, as you mentioned, I think one of the things that's troubling is, if you think about it, an unelected police superintendent has said to an elected official, we should have the power to do more of your job. And the elected official said to the unelected official, okay. I think that's one of that's another part of this that's a troubling part of this narrative. And the fact is that the police superintendent shouldn't be making policy for Cook County in terms of the way that gun charges are made, or pretend that his officers are really in a position to make a decision about someone's life by charging them with a felony and or a misdemeanor.
Especially here in the city of Chicago, when we are the capital of wrongful convictions by having 540 wrongful convictions, more than any other city or state in the country.
Yep.
That they want for us to give them more trust. Ed Yohnka, thank you very much for coming on. Tell us tell us how we can support the work that you all are continuing to do, because I know that your work has been increased by what is going on, and there's only so much to go around. But how can people support the work that the ACLU is doing?
You can visit our website at aclu-il.org. There's a place there for you to get involved in a host of different ways. If you can make a donation, we certainly are always glad for that. But if you just want to be more informed about these issues, there's a way you can join our action alert list. So you get messages both at the national level and at the state level about things that are going on. There are other ways to get involved in other materials around that. There's one thing I want to point out, because some of the stuff we've been talking about, we have a little one pager just on the way that the administration is engaging in the abuse of power and the abuse of executive power. It's one of those handy things if you have a neighbor or a friend or a relative or a family member, probably sometimes a close family member who just thinks everything is going along great. Just gives you some ways to sort of talk about these things with those folks, and that I think is really useful. So frankly, it supports our work just for people being out there making that case wherever we can. But we'll take support at any of those levels.
Ed Yohnka, thanks a bunch. I certainly appreciate you coming on, and certainly going to have you to come back.
I'll be happy to do it. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you so much. Good night. All right, folks. All right, listen. We have a whole lot to talk about. We certainly want to thank the ACLU for coming in and giving us some information on what they're doing. Listen, wherever you stand with respect to immigration, what I want to ask for all of us is to not get yourself so wrapped up in an ideology and forget that we are all human beings, and we have a moral responsibility to protect and to help those who are in need. This administration is led by someone who has absolutely no conscience for anyone outside of whatever their desires are, period. And what they are doing is going to be catastrophic, and people are going to suffer down the road drastically. People are going to suffer. People are going to die because they will not have access to health care. They're going to lose their health care. I'm going to provide you with a clip that shows you who is actually going to benefit from this. Now, unless we, the people, elect people that we can put into place federally, and I think that we have a great opportunity to be a great example for our national outlook here in Chicago because of the major metropolitan region that we are in here in Chicago, and the base of people that we have to pull from. That we have to put people in place to protect our own constitutional rights and privileges. If you are under the disguise that some of what is being exacted is not a test to see just how much they can push the envelope and get away with, to do it and gaslight what they want to refer to as illegals. Well, you want to talk about illegal? We can talk about a group of people who illegally brought another group of people by the millions, lives lost by the millions, to come here to build the very infrastructure for which they are thriving from today. If you want to talk about illegals. But that aside, I would ask you to make sure that you do some introspective of your own conscience and not allow for your ideology to be so driven that you ignore your moral responsibility to not supporting dehumanizing anyone. I would just ask all of us to take a step back and to consider. All right, I'm going to talk about healthcare a little bit later on in the program. What I want to talk to you about now is I want to talk to you about property taxes. Here in Cook County, I want to talk to you about the assessor's office. I want to talk to you about the Board of Review. The assessor's office, most people know the assessor's office because the assessor's office gets blamed for anything that has to do with your property taxes going up by 2 cents. If your taxes go up, the assessor gets blamed for that. The Board of Review is this little innocuous office that nobody even knows what it does or who it is and who is in that office. So nobody really pays attention to the Board of Review. The Board of Review is made up of 3 commissioners here in Cook County. And the 3 commissioners, what they do is the Cook County Board of Review is this quasi-judicial body that are 3 elected commissioners that has the power to review and to reassess valuations on properties for property taxes. Now, that is a fancy way of saying that these 3 people represent 3 districts. There's 1, 2, and 3. The 2nd district is the south side of Chicago and the south suburbs, going all the way out to the county line. The 1st district is largely the north side, going all the way out to the northern suburbs. The 3rd district is going all the way out to the western suburbs. And let's see here. You have, let me see. I want to make sure I pull this up. So let me just pull this up real quick. Let's see. Let's pull up the Cook County Board of Review Commissioners. All right, so you have Commissioner Larry Rogers Jr. Is one of the commissioners. You have Samantha Steele and George Cardenas. Larry Rogers Jr. Is the commissioner over District 3. Commissioner Samantha Steele is over District 2, and Commissioner George Cardenas is over District 1. These three people wield a lot of power. So essentially what happens is, if you are a commercial real estate owner, Larry Rogers Jr., who's been a Board of Review commissioner since 1994. He was brought in by what's his I can't think of it of the guy who brought him in, but it'll come to me. So, but he's been a commissioner since 1994. He came in under the auspices that he was going to be a reformer, blah, 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 and all that sort of thing. But he was brought in by the establishment. He was not brought in by the people. He was brought in by the establishment. And so, but he's been there since 1994. Larry Rogers Jr. changed the policy that if you have a commercial property and you want to appeal your taxes or your valuations, you have to hire a tax appeal attorney. The main tax appeal attorney, there's several, but there are two main tax appeal attorneys for decades that made millions and millions of dollars contesting property taxes for commercial property owners. Was Ed Burke and Michael Madigan. They basically set the legislation, and their firms represented very wealthy property owners downtown. So Larry Rogers Jr. puts this into policy that if you want to appeal your taxes, you have to hire a tax appeal attorney. Thusly, that tax appeal attorney is able to successfully reduce your valuation by getting your taxes cut. And that attorney receives 25 to 30% of whatever the amount is that they get reduced on your real estate taxes if you are a wealthy property owner, commercial property owner. As a result, Ed Burke and Michael Madigan, and there were others, made millions of dollars in fees at getting commercial property owners' taxes appealed. They would go before the Board of Review. George Cardenas and Larry Rogers Jr. are lockstep in voting together for people who come before them with tax appeal. These same tax appeal attorneys have flooded Larry Rogers Jr. and George Cardenas' campaign coffers to the tune of about $1 million each. But that's not where Larry Rogers Jr. really benefits. Even though that they have flooded his campaign finances, what they also do is they refer personal injury cases to Larry Rogers Jr.'s firm that he worked with his father, who is now deceased, but Larry Rogers Jr. So he makes millions of dollars in settling personal injury cases that are referred to him by tax appeal attorneys that goes before the Board of Review appealing taxes for commercial property owners. This is the one hand or the couple of hands washing the others. Now, if a property owner, the first process is that they have to go before the assessor. They have to appeal to the assessor. If the assessor reviews and decides against granting a lower valuation for a property, then they could go to the Board of Review, and the Board of Review has the power to override the assessor's decision. So what happens is, a perfect example is the Chicago Bears purchase the racetrack out in Arlington or wherever it was that they purchased the racetrack. They paid $116 million or $130 million or something like that for the land. They immediately hired a tax appeal attorney to go in to appeal their taxes so that they can pay taxes on the property being worth $80 million. So they go before the assessor. The assessor says, no, you just paid 100 and whatever million that it was that you paid for the land, so your valuation stays the same. They go to the Board of Review. The Board of Review overrides the assessor. So every time that a commercial property owner gets their taxes appealed and they're rejected at the assessor, they go before the Board of Review, which is this quasi-judicial review board, and they assess and they take a vote. Samantha Steele has been the one voice that we've had there. Unfortunately, we almost had two, but because most people are not informed and educated, but we are going to do our very best to make sure that more of us and more of you understand how this process works. So the tax appeal attorney goes before the Board of Review, and the Board of Review votes to override the assessor and grants the reduction. Now, that means that billions of dollars in tax revenues that the wealthy property owners now do not have to pay, or paying a reduced tax burden for their wealthy properties, is shifted onto the homeowners of that district. So if Larry Rogers Jr. gives someone a tax reduction, and Larry Rogers Jr. and George Cardenas has shifted more than $1 billion in tax deductions onto the homeowners in the 3rd district and the 2nd district. That means that what you are paying on your property taxes, when you see that your taxes have gone up, but your tax rate is the same, that is because you are paying for a family steak dinner at Maestro's or whatever, or the Chop House, or wherever they take their families to for dinner, that ends up costing about $1,000 or $1,200. And I just kind of use that as an example. You send them to a restaurant to have a steak meal, and they go have the steak meal, you pay the bill. That's essentially what is happening. That is why you are paying on average about a 20% of your bill is on average, you're paying about $1,000 a month. I'm sorry, $1,000 a year to subsidize the tax cuts that Larry Rogers Jr. and George Cardenas has given to wealthy property owners, because the tax cut doesn't go away. Somebody has to pay it. And so what it happens is they, whatever those cuts are, they spread it over the district of all of the homeowners in that district. So we are paying on average of about $1,000 to $1,200 more in property taxes purely to subsidize someone else's taxes. Now, I am going to spend an inordinate amount of time between now and the next election, because we must take control of determining who the people are that we're going to select that are making decisions that we must elect in these offices. We cannot sit on the sideline, and we cannot just complain and not be engaged in the process. So I am going to continue to share this information because most people are not aware of it. I've been in real estate over 40 years, some 42, 43 plus years. And I started to learn about this when Fritz Kagi, who I strongly support, was elected to office. And then I started to finding out more information because Fritz Kagi would put on these informational pages so that we could understand what, and break it down to us what was going on. Because I remember talking to someone who says, I don't understand why my taxes are going up when my tax rate is the same, but my taxes are going up. Your taxes are going up because you are paying your unfair share of somebody else's tax reduction that's been put on to you. Let me go here. I wish I could put it up on the screen, and I'm probably going to have Fritz Kagi to come on to talk about this sometime in the future. But I want to, and I had put this out. I put this out on the on Facebook, just to give you a little sample of this. And this comes from the assessor's office, and you can see it. It's the South and West Suburban Reassessment Report. And here is what the report shows. I wish I could put it up on the screen, but I can't put it up on the screen right now. But next week, we will certainly do this. So in 2023, the reassessment in the South and West suburbs showed from 2022 to 2023. All right. So the reassessment showed that there were 71% of appeals granted by the Board of Review. The residential share of the 71%. Now watch this. The residential share of the 71%. Okay, so property tax bills for both commercial and residential properties should have risen roughly in line with the levies of the various taxing bodies. So that means the taxing bodies in your city or your village where you live, they have to come up with whatever their levies is to support their school districts, to support their government there, and then they have to put in a levy for the assessors to collect those monies in order for them to do it. So according to the Cook County Treasurer, the typical residential bill was up by 20%, while the typical commercial bill was down by 8.5%. So let me just go back here. So it shows that after the assessor's office completed its assessment and the appeals, commercial properties had increased by 39% in value, while residential properties value rose at 36%. There's a 3% lower rate of increased values by on residential properties, which meant that homeowners' tax bills should have held steady or even gone down as homeowners' share of the total assessed value decreased by 1 percentage point from 68% down to 67%. So this means that in 2023, the Board of Review cut commercial assessed values by nearly $1 billion, or 18%. They cut residentials by only $150 million, or 1%. So that $1 billion, remember that $1 billion you and I are going to make up. So that means that the commercial properties represented 87% of the total assessed value, reduced on appeal at the Board of Review, which shifted 4 percentage points of the South triage of $4.4 billion in tax burdens onto homeowners. $4.4 billion that they gave to the downtown property owners in tax reductions. And you and I and all of the homeowners within the district are paying your unfair share of this $4.4 billion. And there are people who think that your taxes have gone up because of the assessor. Your taxes are not going up because of the assessor. If your tax rate is actually going down, but your taxes are going up, that is because you are paying for steak dinners for some people that you don't even know, that you're subsidizing their taxes for their wealthy properties that they own downtown. And you get no benefit of subsidizing their properties. But yet you have the establishment that tried to unseat Fritz Kagi with Carrie Steele in the last election, who was a part of the establishment, who knows nothing about tax assessments, nothing at all. But because they're willing to do what they're told to do by the Democratic establishment. I'm a Democrat, and I'm going to stay a Democrat. we have to infiltrate the Democratic establishment, Democratic Party, because we have people who govern to this elitist approach, and they're completely out of touch with the everyday citizen. And they want to essentially continue to dictate to us. So I want you to understand this. And I want to make it very, very simple. That it is the Board of Review that is shifting the tax cuts that they give to wealthy property owners onto homeowners in the district. Larry Rogers Jr. is the senior commissioner on the Board of Review, and Larry Rogers Jr. is not the friend of our communities. I don't care how many tax appeal gimmicks or presentations that he goes to churches to demonstrate to your church on how you can go and appeal your homeowners' taxes. I just showed you that the increase of commercial properties went up by 39%, the increase of residential 36%. Yet there was a 4.5% reduction. I'm sorry. No, 8.5% reduction in the tax bills for properties that increased by 39%. And what the Board of Review did was allowed for, there should have been a 71%, there was a 71% increase in commercial property taxes, only a 68% in valuations to residential. But yet residential only went down by $150 million, 1%, while commercial properties went down by $1 billion or 18%, but they had an increase in valuation. So that means that $4.5 billion or $4.4 billion of taxes you and I are paying that have nothing to do with our property. Zero to do with our property. But because Larry Rogers Jr. and George Cardenas are the flunkies for the tax appeal attorneys and the wealthy property owners downtown, which is why they're flooding their campaigns, you and I are paying those cuts. $4.5 billion shifted onto homeowners in the district. That's the Board of Review. That's what's happening at the Board of Review. I am going to continue to bring you the information as to what is happening at the Board of Review versus what is happening at the assessor. The assessor, Fritz Cavey, is simply trying to bring a fairness to tax valuations. Now, property values go up. If your property values go up, that means that taxes are going to go up. But disproportionately, taxes are going down for property values that are going up that are commercial properties. And they're getting huge tax cuts while the homeowners are subsidizing those tax cuts. That is happening because of a decision that two people are making at the Board of Review, Larry Rogers Jr. and George Cardenas, are passing this on to you. Now, Larry Rogers Jr. would stand before you or sit before you with a straight face, and you ask the question why, his response will be, well, it is legal and they are following the legal or following the law to get their taxes appealed. It's a legal process. That's his answer. His answer will not be that we are going to make for the commercial property owners, wealthy property owners downtown, to pay their own fair share of the taxes and stop shifting that tax burden on to homeowners. But he won't do it. And you know why he won't do it? Because they put too much money into his coffers, too much money into his campaign, and they refer him millions of dollars in cases that he settles or that his firm settles, that brings them in millions of dollars in revenue. This is what's happening at the Board of Review. And this is why your taxes are increasing. And then the culprit gets away, and the person that everybody turns to is the Cook County assessor. Now, the Democratic establishment would like for you to believe that it's a Cook County assessor. So the Democratic Party or the Democratic establishment did not endorse Fritz Kagi. They endorsed some person that we don't even know who they are to run against Fritz Kagi because they are an establishment person, because they want control of that office. And the person who is actually causing you harm economically, Larry Rogers Jr. By the way, they didn't endorse at the Board of Review. And you know why they didn't endorse at the Board of Review? Because it wasn't Larry Rogers. He's not up for election. It's George Cardenas. And what we need to do is we need to make a selection for the Board of Review to elect someone to go to the Board of Review from that area. And so somebody from the Hispanic community, we, the public, we the people, need to be a part of that process of determining who that candidate would be and who we would elect to, or certainly support to get elected to go to that office. See, this is where power is. Power is in having the numbers to select and elect. And we have the resources for it. And we have to engage ourselves in order for us to make the Democratic establishment come down off of their high horse and talk to us and hear from us and give us a glimmer that they actually get it. But as of today, they don't get it because they're operating as elitists and dictators that they want to dictate to us who the representatives or who the candidates shall be. That's not the way that it's supposed to go. A politician should not be choosing who or selecting who our candidates are. We, the people, should be doing that so that we could stop this type of pilferage going on where everyday working people are subsidizing the taxes for wealthy people, which is the same thing that they just did on the federal level that they decided. All right, let me turn my attention to, and we're going to be talking about this. I'm going to be bringing you information, bringing you the charts, showing this to you, because I want you to understand just who it is that's cooking the books, just who it is that's not our friend. Larry Rogers Jr. is not our friend. He is not the friend of our communities. He is certainly not the friend of homeowners. That dog and pony show that he does by going to churches, having these so-called resource informational meetings on how you can appeal your property taxes. Well, I just showed you. $150 million that they did in reductions for homeowners. $1 billion that they did in reduction for commercial property owners, and shifted $4.5 billion onto homeowners. That is what Larry Rogers Jr. and who he is and what he is doing. And he cannot lie about it. Liars' figures, the figures don't lie. And we've got the receipts. As I just read to you and posted last week on Facebook for you to get just a brief understanding of what it is, excuse me, that Larry Rogers Jr. is doing. All right, I want to talk about this I want to talk about this curfew that the city council voted for and passed, that was sponsored by Alderman Brian Hopkins, because of what they are asserting to these teen takeovers and some of these gatherings that are happening supposedly, downtown. And so the mayor vetoed the curfew. And I understand why the mayor vetoed the curfew, is because it would be a discriminatory policy in place that largely Black young men and women would be impacted by this policy that they were trying to put in place to minimize, as they thought, to these issues that they're trying to deal with. So if you set a curfew, then let's just look at the language of the City Council of Chicago's curfew law that was vetoed by the mayor. All right, so the proposed Chicago curfew, which was vetoed by Mayor Brandon Johnson, would have allowed the police superintendent to declare a curfew in specific areas during times of imminent danger. Now, what does that mean, imminent danger? The law would have established a different curfew hours for minors, different ages, specifically 10 p.m. for minors, 12 and older, 8:30 p.m. or 9 p.m., depending on the day of the week. For minors under 12, until 6 a.m. The following day, according to the Better Government Association, the City Council did not have the votes to override the mayor's veto. Now, some of this is really problematic because I see that curfew law, if in fact it was allowed to go into effect, it will be the black young boys and girls that would disproportionately be impacted by this. Now, I do believe that we need to do something about holding parents more accountable for their children's whereabouts. There should be no 12-year-old that is out by itself without their parents. So rather than a curfew, I would think that maybe there could be some discussion about if your child is out after a certain time, they must be accompanied by an adult. Because in my judgment, a 12-year-old should not be out anywhere by themselves. At 12, the only place that I could go by myself at 12 years of age was either to a relative's house or across the street to the park. That's where I was allowed to go and play tennis or to go to the pool or something of that nature. Not to go run around the city unchaperoned. So I have real concerns about implementing a curfew that in many respects would disproportionately impact young black boys and girls. Even allow for the Chicago Police Department. I don't have that much trust that they would be able to enforce something with that kind of authority and not cause harm to people, to young boys and girls. So I have a real problem with it and could not be in support of a curfew such as this at this point. But I do believe that parents need to be more aware of where their children are and why a 12-year-old, for the life of me, would be out without their parent. Now, I would be more of a thought of holding parents responsible, in particular, that they have young children out that's engaging in nefarious activity. And obviously there has to be investigation and that sort of thing. But I don't like the idea of empowering the Chicago Police Department to enforce this and enforce this in a very humane way. I can certainly see them mishandling some young person the way that we have seen police officers handle people in the past. So I, for now, would be opposed to that kind of curfew for those reasons. For those reasons, that I don't think that we have to have a curfew passed. And then Brian Hopkins, who is a white alderman who covers some portion of downtown, this is a policy that largely targets Black young boys and girls because they don't want them downtown. You don't want them at Millennium Park. Now, some of the activities that I see teenagers getting into, with these teen takeovers and that sort of thing, I just, especially when they turn dangerous. No, I don't agree with that. But I don't agree with giving the police more power, just as the Cook County State's Attorney has done, giving the police more power to charge people with a felony and giving the police the power to enforce a curfew, which means that they can take children into custody. I'm not willing to go along. I'm not willing to go along with that. All right, listen. I want to spend just a couple of minutes that we got the tragic news today that Malcolm Jamal Warner died in an accidental drowning while vacationing with his family. Very sad to get that, to hear that news at 54 years of age, that he was out with his family and there was some sort of accident that happened, and he did not survive. So certainly we pray for his family and his wife and children and his entire extended family. We certainly send our thoughts and prayers out to them during this time of mourning and time of transition. But understand that God has got you. He has got you. I've been doing the peace walks with Father Flager for this summer. In fact, I've been on each one of them. There won't be a peace walk this Friday because of their day of service that they're taking for. And I asked Father Flager last week, I said, have you ever tried to organize a sort of citywide peace march with some of the other pastors in some of the other communities around the city? And he told me that he has tried to do that, but could not get the kind of support. And there was all kinds of excuses that pastors gave about, they couldn't get their members out, blah, blah, blah. And now you see that um, they will place a heavy emphasis on going. People needed to come to church and that sort of thing. Well, I was doing some of my meditation, and it brought me to the book of Isaiah. And it is a book where God is dealing with a rebellious nation. And in today, that would be representative of the church, that God was speaking to Israel, not talking to people in the streets. He's talking to his people. And I want to read from the Message of what he says. I don't know if I have enough time to read all of it, but I want to just give you some of what he's saying. Now, he's talking to the church, not talking to people out that are in the world. He's talking to his people, where he says, "My people have walked out on me, their God." Not the people in the street. "Turn their backs on the Holy of Israel. Walked off and never looked back. Why bother even trying to do anything with you when you just keep to your bull-headed ways? You keep beating your heads against the brick walls, everything within your protest against you, from the bottom of your feet to the top of your head, nothing working right. Wounds and bruises and running sores, unattended, unwashed, unbandaged. Your country is laid waste. Your cities burned down. Your land is destroyed by outsiders while you watch, reduced to rubble by barbarians. Daughter Zion is deserted, like a tumble-down shack on a dead-end street, like a tar paper shanty on the wrong side of the tracks, like sinking ships abandoned by rats. If God of the angel armies hadn't left us a few survivors, we'd be as desolate as Sodom, doomed just like Gomorrah. Now he's talking to the church. He's not talking to the people in the street. And my point is that pastors and preachers like to do a whole lot of boasting. And I am a follower of Christ, and I believe in the church of God. The secular church is the one that I have a real problem. And this is who God is talking about in this chapter of Isaiah. But all of these preachers that spend all their time with armor bearers, 15 armor bearers, and the people across the street don't even know your name. If you walk you down the street today, would nobody even know who you were, right where your church is assembled. Nobody would know you. If you walk down the street by yourself, not a single person where your church is situated would know who you are. I want to talk more about that next week. Or I might even do a different podcast to talk really about the church's role and why churches are emptying out today. I want to certainly thank my guest, Ed Yohnka of the ACLU, who stopped by to be with us tonight. Next Monday is Monroe Monday. Make sure you tune in on the next edition of the People Show on Monroe Monday. Will be with us next week. I want to thank all of those who tuned in right here at intellectualradio.com. We will see you next week. Same time, same place. Good night.